Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. Generation Beta, or Gen Beta, refers to the demographic cohort born from January the 1st, 2025 to 2039, yet to be born perhaps. Gen Beta is a generation poised to inherit a complex world shaped by technological advancements and environmental challenges. They're expected to be adaptable, tech-savvy, and environmentally conscious, potentially leading the way in innovation and sustainability. Leading global futurists Whittington and Joana Lenkova have been considering the future of humanity through the lens of 6 personas in their Meet Gen Beta, the Kids from the Future series. But who are the kids and what do they tell us about the emerging future? Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Alex and Joana to the podcasts. Alex, Joana, welcome back. Great to see you again.
It's great to see you, Steve.
Thank you for having us, Steve.
You're both very welcome. Let me start with you, Alex. I've given this kind of really brief introduction, but who are or what is Gen Beta and what makes them different from previous generations?
Perfect opening question, Steve, because we walk around, a lot of us futurists refer to this generation or that generation, and we sort of assume that people are on the ball with what we're talking about. But we, in foresight and in a lot of other fields, in marketing, in business, and education, we tend to look at generations, right? These sort of age cohorts, people who share a time and place in history. And, I belong to Generation X, which is pretty much a globally recognized generation. The baby boomers, of course, are one of the most famous, largest generations. Go, Steve, team baby boomer. We all tend to be mixing these days. We have a lot of generations in the workplace. So it's kind of a hot topic. As people live longer and also as the birth rate declines, we've got this sort of strange demographic mix going on. So generations can be a really useful way of talking about people in society and what's changing. And what I like to look at, and I think you see this through this article, is the zeitgeist of a time, right? The zeitgeist, the feeling, the mood, and how a generation tends to be very defined by that and in turn define it as well. So Gen Beta is the most recent generation. They're going to start being born, or they have started being born in 2025, according to who you ask, right? Generations, again, is sort of an amorphous measurement. It's roughly every 20, 30 years. And there are different approaches to naming the generations. But currently we're on beta, which came after alpha. So alpha, Gen Alpha, is currently kind of like the kids, the elementary school, primary, tweens, that sort of age group. Gen Beta is their younger cousins, brothers, sisters that are just now being born. So it's sort of the next upcoming generation. And unlike the boomers and Gen X, we've now switched to a new sort of naming convention. The next alphabet, let's say, starting with alpha, now we're on beta. So that's just sort of the nature of how this labeling is taking place. So what makes them different? I think, a couple things stand out. They're the first kind of AI native, or at least, chat GPT native, we might say, generation. And they're being born into this world of uncertainty, of polarities, and a lot of transition and turbulence. So I think that's one of the things that makes them different. But there's probably a lot more to them than we can imagine yet. They're only now sort of blip on our radar.
It's funny you say that because I just scribbled down there, can we imagine their futures? And I guess that's the point of working with these personas that we'll get into in due course. And Joana, from your point of view, what do you think underpins the development of these 6 personas? What are the key trends, the key drivers that you looked to in creating the personas?
I wanted to just add a couple of things on the generations, because I really loved what Alex said about the feeling, like trying to feel what the childhood is going to look like in the future. And I know we put boundaries and we talk about generations, but all of these external environments and all of these external trends shape at a moment of time how every generation feels and acts. So while we are generalizing and talking about a generation, and Alex and I have tried to imagine what the generation could be like in the face of these 6 personas, I think it's also important to highlight that we're getting to a point where we have so many cultures and subcultures and layers that it's just so interesting to unpick and to unveil these sub movements that are happening. A lot of times they're simultaneously going on, but they're clashing. So it's really, really interesting to track the development of these mini cultures. And I think for Generation Beta, that is going to be one of the things that is going to be even more prominent, because I feel that they will be growing up in a world that is a lot more polarized in any sense of the world, of the word. I also think that in a big sense, they will be maybe even co-creating their childhood because of where technology has gotten to. And also because maybe they will be expected to be sitting around the table. We talk a lot now about giving youth voices an opportunity to express themselves and shape the future policies and the future in general. So maybe that's going to be even an expectation for this new generation. So I think these are some of the things that we can talk to. Of course, climate disruption, but also opportunity, I think. If you look at the positive side and the positive trends that are happening, there is so much reconnection to nature. There's so much education around how to use technology in a more healthy way, or at least a lot of discussions around that. So you would expect that in the next few years, there is going to be positive change in that sense. Things around biotech, things around really science and technology that enables us to be more equal, to achieve things that we couldn't do before. If I put the positive lens, I think this is a really great opportunity to look forward to.
One of the things that strikes me is that it seems to be getting harder to differentiate between society and people, the environment and technology. You know, it seems to be easier when I think back to kind of separate those things into different buckets. But increasingly, they seem so interrelated that a conversation about one leads to another. So, how do you think, get people to focus on the people or the human rather than on some of those underlying challenges that we expect people in the future to resolve?
Well, I can just start really briefly by saying, stories. The only way that we can captivate audiences is by having some story to tell.
Mm.
And that can usually, revolve around some human character, persona, or, just those human tensions and human experiences. Usually, I think personas or, the human centeredness tends to be a major feature of the storytelling that we do. And that's what sort of sets us apart from other people who talk about the future. It's not just technology, there's a human thread.
I wonder, it's so interesting you're saying that. I wonder, I think a lot about how the ecosystem is going to evolve and how we have new players in the ecosystem and how we as humans, of course, we're humans, so we would put ourselves as kind of the focus of the story, the main protagonist of the story. But I feel like there will be stories that come from a different perspective, personas from like the nature world, or from AI, robotics. So it would be, maybe that's the next thing we should do, Alex.
That's there's a whole new podcast there, isn't it, about
Yeah.
different AI personas. But I think that's taken us really nicely to the six personas. So I'm going to ask each of you in a kind of a relatively random order just to tell us a little bit about the six personas. So the smart city kid, Joanna, what's the smart city kid about?
The smart city kid, first of all, the smart city kid's name is Tervel. Tervel is also my nephew's name, and it's a very, very traditional Bulgarian name. I wanted to kind of juxtapose the high tech with the tradition and the background and the ancestry. So Tervel grows up in this meticulously designed environment. It's a city that is functioning as basically a living laboratory, as maybe an experiment to a certain extent. And in the story, there are several different types of cities, different types of experiments where kids grow up and they communicate and they collaborate. And in this particular city, Tervo is part of a community where every decision from energy use to civic policy is driven by data. But at the same time, he has a say in these decisions, and he's an active contributor to this community. So childhood here is about active participation. Kids themselves help govern their cities. They are guided by AI mentors, and there is and the ancestors are also present through this new technology. So you're able to basically speak to your ancestors when you take decisions, but also perhaps with kids or people from the future. So it's not only about technology. It is technology is a big part of it, but it's the way that it's used. It really brings out the human traits and the human connections in it. At the end of the story, if you spoiler alert, it turns out that actually Tervel is a cyborg. So there you go.
Fascinating. I suspect that so many questions are going to go whiz through my mind when we talk about each of the kids in the series. Alex, the neo-indigenous hippie kid. When I first saw this had you written all over it. Tell us about this kid.
Well, what's interesting, I'm glad you picked this one first, Steve, because this one's a little bit of an outlier when it comes to these personas. Because unlike the other stories, there's not one central character. This group is really represented by collectivity, right? By community and by, kinship and social and cultural connections. The idea for this kid or group of kids came from an actual study that was conducted, I think, in 2024. It's a very recent study that proposed that every child born starting in roughly 2024, 25, right, the Gen Beta time, would end up having to bear the expense or the cost of up to $1 million in their lifetime due to environmental degradation, climate change. So climate change is costing kids money. That's the reality. So a common technique, you might say, in exploring the future is to sort of flip that reality. So in the story, instead of kids of Gen Beta being out $1 million, right, due to the fact of people not caring about climate change, we flipped the story around. And instead, every single member of Generation Beta is able to receive a $1 million trust fund thanks to the work of indigenous communities making smart business decisions with land rights, mineral rights, and also how to sort of care for and tend for natural resources. That turned out to be quite a profitable, green economy in this future. So the neo-indigenous hippie kids are sort of living large on the fact that we solved climate change, right? On the fact that we turned around this very dangerous road that we're on to, having to bear not only financially, but also health-wise, culturally, socially, not to mention, the sort of existential angst of dealing with climate change. So it's sort of a different persona. Again, it's not a single person. It's all about the group working together to change things for the better.
And Alex, what we've got you on, what about the unschoolers? Well, what are the characteristics we see here?
Sure. Yeah. The unschoolers are, as you know, Steve, topic that I think all three of us are huge fans of. Education comes into play here. And unschooling is something, again, it's something that does exist now. It's this idea of kids kind of forming their own school curriculum, whether they're in a homeschooling environment or some sort of, collective. But the character in this story, her name is Sophia, and she's an unschooler. And we suggest that in Generation Beta, many children will have the opportunity to choose what they want to learn through the help of AI and other education technologies that make knowledge so accessible, so personalized, so 24/7, round the clock. Pick your device that you want to learn from. So I think that ties in really well with what Joana was talking about children becoming more, having more of a role to play in society and major decisions. They're very, very smart and they have access to a lot of information thanks to technology. So it would seem wise to, converge those two and take advantage of these sort of unschooler, kids that pursue their passion when it comes to learning, and tap into that knowledge to advance, public policy or whatever it might be.
And Joanna, tell us about the solutionists, because I don't know, from my senses, there's a kind of, I guess there's a link between all of these. There are similarities and differences. So what might we see from the solutionist kids?
The idea for the solutionist kit came from us thinking about the skills that will be needed for the future. And while we're talking a lot about critical thinking, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about, different forms of creativity. One of the things that is not spoken enough about is conflict resolution. And the solutionist, her name is Amani. So the kid that represents the solutionist children is focused on that. So she grows up in a world that is defined by scarcity, by disruption, and of course by resilience. This is one of the skills that is needed, as well as conflict resolution. So traditional education kind of gives way to these problem solving and collaboration type of skills as children learn to adapt, but not only adapt, but proactively actually innovate their environment with limited resources. And yes, all of the personas are connected. So what Alex was just talking about, in terms of children being more active participants, and it's something that I think as adults, we have to be careful about, because it almost feels like there's an expectation of children to be solving problems. This is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about children being allowed to do that, but in the case of the solutionist, it feels like they don't really have another choice. There is an expectation imposed on them. So the example that is in this persona's narrative is that she's built a filtration system, and then you can read about them growing their own food, mediating conflicts, and the overall feeling and the overall constellation of this world is very focused on, like, deeply community oriented and very purpose driven as well. I was going to say despite of, but maybe it's because of, it's a conflict world.
Fascinating. And one of the ones that I was also deeply curious about are the outer space kids. Joanna, tell us about them. I had a vision of them following Elon Musk to Mars.
Well, that could have been inspired by some missions here and there and research that is done. Of course, yes. Steve, I don't think we should be talking about Elon Musk on the podcast.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I'm not a huge fan. So the space baby idea came around because there is a lot of conversation about obviously colonizing different planets and saving humanity in case we're not able to save Earth for climate reasons, and we were just curious to see where the research has gotten us, how far the research has gotten us so far. And there are two things one thing is important. If we were to inhabit other planets and live or move humanity in outer space, we would have to learn how to reproduce if we want to continue to exist as a species, right? But there are problems with that. So it's not that easy. This is not possible to be done in outer space because of radiation and because of gravitational forces. So this is an exploration of kind of a midway to be able to do that in outer space. And the space baby is born and is raised beyond Earth, but it's actually in orbiting habitats or sort of lunar bases. And the kid represents this complete redefinition of what it means to be human, really, because the child could here is shaped by this closed loop system, artificial gravity, bioprinted healthcare, ethical questions. There are ethical questions around rights, identity, consciousness, beyond these national borders. And I know there is recent advancements in terms of artificial wombs, for example. There is also maybe a year ago there was a discussion about what time zone the moon is going to be in. Also, there's going to have to be a nationality for these people who are born in outer space. So which nationality they'll have. So I think it's quite an interesting exploration. Again, it's an outlier. It might not be a kid that is born in 5 years' time, but it's interesting to explore what the challenges are and just be curious about the research that is done so far. And it's an interesting one as well because Alex and I wrote another set of future kids in 21, and one of the kids there, I guess the most controversial one, was the designer baby, which clearly is happening today. But we had quite interesting conversations with people who kind of rejected the notion. So we're not trying to say this is what's going to happen here. That's why we're futurists. We're here to explore and push boundaries and try and provoke and challenge and explore the new ways of the future.
And I'll make sure there's a link in the podcast description to those to their last podcast where we spoke about the other personas that you and Alex worked on. And Alex, finally, the ghost worker. What on earth is a ghost worker?
Yeah, well, this is probably the dark scenario, or maybe the darkest of the set, I must say. Every scenario set tends to produce kind of like a positive view, excuse me, and sort of a negative view. We sort of touch all these different extremes. A ghost worker is a type of worker that currently exists. We call it a ghost worker because it's someone that you don't usually see. They do sort of this invisible labor that underlies the modern digital economy, including AI, including some of the automation, including some of the self-driving stuff. There's been, what am I trying to say, exposés and journalistic inquiries into kind of self-driving cars. I can't remember now if it was which brand or which car it was, but there were like human actors in the background making decisions and judgments to make sure AI was successful in whatever it was doing for the human user. So this idea of the ghost worker is not new, but what we're projecting as sort of a logical extreme is that these sort of digital sweatshops, you might say, proliferate and form a new underclass comprised mainly of people from the developing world, and many times very young people, working in these roles that aren't well paid, that aren't well protected. They have very few workers' rights, and they tend to be exposed to kind of the worst corners of the internet and digital content. So there's also that aspect. So in terms of Gen Beta, we kind of turn Gen Beta into the next labor movement against this ghost working conditions, these harmful, exploitative working conditions. And so the main character, Nova, leads up a movement to establish workers' rights, to pay them fairly, to protect them. It's sort of like a revisiting of the different labor movements of the past, right? It has that same sort of trajectory. The workers rise up, they come together, they form a collective, and then those sorts of jobs are no longer, the sort of drag on society that they once were. So that's sort of the dark side of Gen Beta, but we felt it was important to include it because it's not all, smart cities and robots and going to space, all this neat stuff. There are realities that are now being formed, right? Things are happening right now are laying the pathwork, and it's up to us to make sure we don't go to those dark places.
One of the things I've taken from those 6 personas is how important to look back, looking forward. That the connection between the two, to learn the lessons when we look back, so perhaps we can make better decisions in the future. So, with that in mind, what do these personas tell us about the emerging future? Joanna, what do you think?
These personas are really grounded in these observable signals and this structural shift that we're already seeing unfolding today. And particularly the persona Alex was describing now, it kind of, you know, reminds me of many generational problems that we haven't solved. So the sweatshops, we don't want to transfer them into the future, is what I'm saying. So this whole movement of trying to protect children's rights or human rights, this is a recurring topic throughout history. So I think you're right, Steve. It's extremely important to look at what we don't want to repeat. And this is our role here with Alex, to really create these maybe to some unimaginable scenarios, but really with links to what we're seeing today, and with proof, and with research, and with evidence that this could potentially happen. I think these personas paint a picture of this future that is uneven. It's deeply experimental. We can see that childhood is not it's not a single childhood. It's not a universal experience. It's not an experience of childhood that every geographical location and every culture is going to feel the same way. It will really vary dramatically depending on geography, access, circumstance, climate, and like way of living as well. I think they also challenge us to think very differently about agency, about equity, about ethics. I think we are going to be exposed to decisions that we cannot even imagine that we will have to take. So the more we speculate about the future, the better it is, because we can be a little bit more prepared. Some of the kids, like Terval, for example, they show us the promise, but also the risk of having an optimized AI-driven type of life, systems where childhood kind of becomes a civic role, maybe not by choice, but because you have to apply to live in a city that is actually livable. Amani, it reminds us about resilience and collective intelligence, and so do the new indigenous hippie kids. That connection to nature, or preservation of what we know that has worked. And one of the things that always strikes me is there was a stat about indigenous people inhabiting 5% of the planet, but preserving 85% of like the bio environment.
Yeah.
So imagine if really we started to listen a little bit more to what we know worked well. So yeah, I think the other kids also show us that we can push boundaries, and that we will be pushing boundaries on what human even means. And again, that considers us to not considers us, but pushes us to consider rights, identity, communication, conflict, and even governance beyond Earth, beyond what we know. So I think it's the most important thing here is that they highlight this urgency to make certain choices now. So we talk about the future and the personas of the future, but actually the actions need to be taken now.
And building on that, Alex, it strikes me that there's this kind of essential balance between the familiar and radical differences, and that we need, perhaps through looking at things like these personas that you've both put together, to understand how we make that balance successful to give us a future that's better than it might otherwise be.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that we surprisingly often will strike that balance by hitting the extremes, by sort of talking about, the very, optimistic or the very pessimistic or the super utopian.
Yeah.
A lot of times we have to use those as devices to get to today's decisions, right? We have to sort of push ourselves to those limits then we come back to the kind of present, okay, what do we need to choose here and now to prevent those extremes from coming to pass or bring the ones that we want?
That's actually a really nice way to end, I think, to use these insights to help us create the future that we want. Alex, Joana, as always, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
Always a
Thank
pleasure. Thank you,
you.
Steve.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another episode of the podcast again. And do let your friends and colleagues know all about the Informing Choices mini pod. There'll be another episode along very soon.